Hello and welcome to another episode of Anomalies. I'm one of your hosts, Dan Hall, and it's been a while since we've done one of these shows, so it's good to see my buddy of 25 years, David Jinks, is here today. Dave, what's happening in your part of Olympia?
Well, same as yours. I think we're getting finally getting our, 3 months of good weather, so everybody's trying to get outside and do stuff, play
Yeah,
sports and go camping or whatever. But I still like to stay inside and sit in front of the camera and do Zoom meetings with very interesting people, and we've definitely got one of
yeah,
those people today.
yeah. Our guest today is I mean, I didn't know so much about him, but I had certainly heard about his grandparents. Our guest today is Chris McKinnell, and his grandparents were Ed and Lorraine Warren. And it's like if you're into the paranormal at all, you've got to have heard about Ed and Lorraine Warren. So, Chris, welcome to our show.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be
Sure,
here.
sure. Pleasure to have you. So, one of the things I want to start with is um, there's probably two two images of your grandparents. There's the one that the media produced. Uh, I've heard your grandfather referred to as a demonologist.
hmm
Would that be accurate?
That is what he called himself. He was considered a religious demonologist. There's a distinction there.
Okay. And then your grandmother was uh, a medium, psychic
He
medium.
called herself a light trance clairvoyant.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
and she had mediumship abilities as well. So do I. I
Okay.
inherited not quite all, but most of her abilities.
You're their your grandparents' grandchild. So let's start with this. Who were these people? How did you know them? How is their image of uh, that you got to know different than the public image that's out there, both of them?
Oh, quite different, really. I mean, it's the movies are wonderful, and Vera Farmiga and Patrick Wilson are wonderful actors. They're beautiful people, but I don't see my grandparents when I watch those movies, not at all. And when you look at old videos of my grandparents, you're only seeing a slice of who they really are. My grandfather, yes, he could be belligerent if you challenged him on his beliefs, if you acted like you didn't have any respect for him. But on the other hand, he was a joker. He was a fun guy. He was both of them were unbelievably caring people who would drop anything to help anyone. Especially, and they would also do that with animals, which they
Hmm.
passed on to the rest of the family. One of my favorite stories about my grandfather. There was this beautiful big collie. Uh, it, he was passing. It was wintertime. The dog was wrapped around a tree with a chain in a muddy, icy puddle, matted, long fur, just miserable. And he walked up to the front door, slammed his hand on the door, and said, "You just lost your dog." And he brought the dog home with him. And the dog, he named him Duke because my grandfather loved John Wayne. Not my,
John Wayne, I was going to say John Wayne.
yeah. But my grandmother, on the other hand, I know she looks sweet on video and in TV shows. That is just barely scratching the surface of how sweet my grandmother was. You know, you walked into her house and she's like, "Oh dear, would you like me to bake you a cake? Wait, did you need something to eat?" I mean, honestly, she was the sweetest woman that ever walked the earth. I just cannot say enough good about my grandmother. And she's still wonderful. I mean, she visits
Yeah.
not terribly often, but she does definitely visit.
Yeah. Those sound like good memories of your grandparents. Um, so when did you first get exposed to the paranormal stuff that they were into?
Well, let's see. I was 3 years old when I was locked in their museum by my 2-year-old sister. Um, it didn't last long, just a few moments, and my grandfather luckily was in the office in the back and came running, but it left an impression. It's my first memory in my life, and it terrified me. I was actually afraid of the dark until I went on my first case when I was 16. And that taught me, my grandfather took me on a over-the-top poltergeist case straight out of Hollywood that I've never experienced anything like that again in my life. And I've been on 10,000 cases, most of which, of course, you know, super fast, one contact with the family and everything's fine. But that was the most over-the-top phenomena-packed case I've ever been on. And
Tell us about that case.
well, as I said, I was 16 years old. I had just finished 11th grade, and it was August. And my grandfather called and he said, "Chris, we've got a case tonight. I want you to come with me." I was like, he'd never, ever talked to me about my going on a case with him. Never. And I thought, what the hell am I doing? You know? My mother, who has never liked the paranormal, has nothing at all to do with it, ever, for some reason allowed me to go. And he picked me up with a man named Paul Bartz. My grandmother was not there that night, which is strange. I don't even know why. And we went up to Lee, Massachusetts. The husband and wife were sitting outside on the stairs. They would not go in without us. They had two girls, but the girls were staying with someone else that night. They had not been living in that house since all hell broke loose. When I walked in with them into this tiny little tract house, the whole house was shaking from pounding in the walls. It was coming in repetitions of 3. And we looked around the living room. There was a recliner and a couch and nothing else. All the other furniture had been removed because it was flying around. We went into the kitchen, tiny kitchen. The refrigerator was gone because that had flown across the room. But the stove was still there. Pots and pans were still there for some reason. As we went up the stairs, I could hear clawing and growling coming out of the walls, and the walls were shaking. We get to the top of the stairs, and I look into the bathroom to my left, and there's this giant funeral cross on the wall, and it's upside down, straight out of Hollywood. There was a pull-down staircase to the attic that was pulled down, and I was told that the woman, one night, she was alone in her bedroom. Her husband was working at the mill that night. And this hulking black shape came into the room, picked up her rosary and twirled it as if to say, "You think this is going to stop me?" As she had run across the hall to get to her first daughter's room, the door would not open, even though there were no locks. And then the staircase came down on her head. When she came to her senses, she was able to get them out. And that was that. They didn't go back. My grandfather decided, "Chris, I want you to sit in the dark in the master bedroom where this woman was attacked, and we're going to go downstairs and we're going to use religious provocation to try to make this thing reveal itself." I cannot stress enough how dangerous it is to use religious provocation, and nobody should do that. No one. So I'm thinking to myself, you want to do what? I mean, you don't have a good idea what we're dealing with given what's going on around us? But my grandfather had tried to get into the Marines at 16 to go to World War II, and he managed at 17 to join the Navy. So I wasn't going to let him down. I sat in there for an hour listening to all of this stuff while they're downstairs with a kitchen pot full of church incense smudging downstairs. But every time they tried to come upstairs, it would go out, which is really strange. Once this stuff gets going, it goes. So about an hour later, Paul Bartz came up and relieved me, and I went downstairs very gratefully. Now that night, we were on WTIC AM Radio 1060 with Brian Dow. It was an overnight radio station. We were on the phone doing a live show. Not even a 7-second delay that night. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, the husband and Paul were upstairs in one of the girls' rooms on a princess phone. I was in the recliner downstairs on a phone, holding that big cross in my hand because I didn't have any other protection. And the woman and my grandfather were on the couch. Now it was pitch black. We turned out all the lights. And we're talking about the history and what the family had already experienced and how they had gotten the house and everything. When two hulking black shapes came down the stairs and stood on the landing, and we could see them even in the dark. Then this was 3 o'clock. At about 3:15, the woman screams that her face is on fire. My grandfather put the flashlight on her face, and we watched 3 claw marks appear on the left side of her face and blood drip
Oh
onto
my
her.
gosh.
Yeah. And then that pot with the Holy Church incense in it flew out of the kitchen, around the corner, and straight at my head. It just missed me. It hit the window behind me. The shade flew up. The pot was crushed against the window, but the window didn't break. I said, I said an expletive over the radio because it took me by surprise. And the woman started screaming that she wanted to get out of the house. And I thought, that's a great idea. I'll help. So I ran to the front door, and the door that we had actually been through that door a couple of times, it wouldn't open. And the lights are going on and off. And I'm like 3 feet away from these 2 hulking black shapes. And then the recliner that I had just been in flips over and comes at me. And then the door opens by itself. She and I ran out. One of us got physically ill. Honestly, I cannot remember which of us it was. It's been that long, 44 years. But we left my grandfather sitting there on the couch, calmly describing what was going on around him. I thought, that is the bravest man I've ever seen in my entire life. And the next day, and this is why I'll always be grateful to my grandfather, that next night, I went to bed without the light on for the first time in my life. I realized if you face your fears, if you immerse yourself in them, and you survive it, you can survive anything, and you'll never be afraid.
Oh, interesting case. I might have run out the door and not come back. That might have been my response.
I understand that, and that is probably the more human reaction.
Right.
But you know what? I was fascinated. I'd already spent my childhood trying to understand spirituality. I mean, heck, this was my grandparents. I started going on lecture tours with them at 14. And I saw my grandmother do amazing things during interviews. So I had a lot of questions. I'd had catechism with the Catholic Church. That didn't sit with me. I tried being with the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses, and then Buddhism, and on and on and on and on. And that was just the path I was on, trying to really understand. Then I got into quantum physics, and that took me into a whole nother realm, and psychology, which I think is vital. If you don't understand psychology, you shouldn't be working in the paranormal.
Dave, why don't you jump in here?
Well, that's a good segue because the question I just wrote, and I don't know if we're there yet in the conversation, we kind of jumped right to the crux of it all, which is the psychological aspects of these phenomena around you. In your many decades of investigation and experiences and talking with people who've had these experiences, do you view this as a creation coming from the witness? Is it an openness from other entities that allow these, very strange, sometimes violent interactions to occur? Is it a complicated mix of us and them? Is it something entirely different, reaching into the collective unconsciousness, or the quantum realm you just mentioned? What do you think really is the genesis of these types of things, or are there many different ones?
Exactly. Many different, because half the job of anybody who does this is defining the problem. And it is not easy. Every case is unique. For instance, poltergeist phenomena. That can actually be a ghost. It can. My grandparents had a very famous case where it was just an old man who did not want anyone in his house. He was slamming drawers and cabinets, throwing dishes, moving the table. And my grandmother tried to talk to him and explain the family that lived there now had a right to be there. He wasn't having any of it. And that's the thing. A human spirit has free will. They will do what they want to do. There's very little you can do except try to mediate. But it can also be an out of control psychic whose abilities are not, they don't really know how to use them properly. And when they get upset, the lights start flickering, things might go flying, the TV turns on and off, their batteries on their cell phone drain, their computer explodes. All of that is perfectly normal, unfortunately, for an out of control psychic. But I don't believe in demons. My grandfather, famously demonologist, he called me a demonologist when I was 22. And I was very proud of that at 22. But by 26, I realized I have no idea what this is. And I certainly call myself that. I have gone through a million different ideas of what it could be. But my best understanding today, let me first say this. When you're watching anything with my grandparents or reading their books, which they did not write, so some of them are good, some of them are bad, depending on who was writing them, you're still only seeing a snapshot in time. You are not seeing where they ended up. And you should not be treating that as your training course for the paranormal. I had the benefit of my grandparents. They didn't have anybody before them. And I've been able to travel around the world. I've lived in 106 places around the world. And I've studied with everybody from indigenous tribes in the jungles of Colombia to the Dalai Lama. I have learned that the paranormal manifests according to our own cultural and spiritual beliefs. That doesn't mean there are not spirits involved. What it means, as far as I can understand today, these are a manifestation of our own human power that take on a life of their own and can have limited intelligence, but they are reactive, not active. So they can be a poltergeist, they can be a demon, they can be all sorts of different things, and they can show some limited intelligence. But if you were to accept the idea of fallen angels being demons, then you have to say that these things have the wisdom of the ages. And I have never, ever seen any evidence of that. I've never seen anything demonic that is half as evil as what a human being can do to another human being. Yes, I've had 2 people die. I've had my grandfather have a heart attack during an exorcism while I was there. They can be deadly, but they are not what we want to put on them. The same thing with Annabelle. Everybody's terrified of Annabelle. I mean, I live in South America, and the people go nuts when these rumors get started that Annabelle's escaped the museum. No, Annabelle has never escaped the museum. It is not.
Chris, just for clarification, tell the audience who Annabelle is. Some people might not know.
Okay, well, there have been plenty of movies about Annabelle, and the movies are fantasies. There's nothing at all real about it. Annabelle is a Knickerbocker Raggedy Ann doll. And it was owned by 2 nursing students back in 1970. It was given to them by one of the women. Her name was Debbie. Her mother gave it to them. They loved the doll. They poured their energy into it. And one day, the doll's arms levitated up onto the table. Now, it was the age of Aquarius. They were all like, ooh, there must be a spirit in there. And so they decided to do seances with somebody who called herself a medium. Look, I'm a medium. My grandmother was an amazing psychic. But even my grandmother said the best psychic in the world is only right 60% of the time. This is a lousy percentage to bet your life on.
Yeah.
And if you believe what a medium's telling you, you are giving power to that story. We are storytellers. we can make our stories materialize, especially through fear or hatred or anger, because those are the times we're pumping out more electromagnetic energy, and these things manifest through that energy. So at first, the girls love this doll. They're told that it's the ghost of a little girl named Annabelle Higgins, who had died in front of the house and was just looking for somebody to love her. They buy it jewelry. There's still a bracelet on its wrist, if you want to call it a wrist. And they take it everywhere. They talk to it. They're pouring more and more energy into it, and it starts acting like a little girl. So it will play hide and seek. When they go to work, they come home, it's now in a new location. When they come home, maybe they find notes on parchment paper written in crayon. They didn't own parchment paper or crayon, but they things like miss me, want to play. And the girls started to get creeped out.
Yeah.
They thought, there's something watching us. It doesn't feel safe anymore. Their energy changed. And now the messages were more like, help me. And that creeped them out even more. They were forming something known as an egregore or a tulpa. In this case, it would actually be a tulpa. An egregore is a manifestation of a group of people believing in something. And a tulpa is something that's done through individual effort. And they were literally creating a spirit. It is a spirit, but it's created by us. So one afternoon, one of the boyfriends was sleeping on the couch, and he wakes up and he says, I just had a dream that Annabelle was on top of me, choking me to death. He got up, walked over to the chair that Annabelle was in, picked it up and said, you're a stupid doll, you couldn't hurt anyone, and threw it across the room. As soon as he did that, according to my grandfather, all hell broke loose in the room, and pictures were shaking on the wall, the walls were banging, the chair that doll had been in shot across the room. And then the young man felt this burning pain in his chest, and there were claw marks on his chest and blood coming through his t-shirt. They called Father Traybolt. I think that's it, Father Traybolt. He was a Lutheran priest in Hartford. I hope I got that name right. And he happened to know my grandparents. This was long before my grandparents were famous. You know, that's the thing people want to say, oh, they just were in it for the fame. They did this for over 20 years in complete anonymity.
Mm-hmm.
So, but they learned the publicity allowed them to reach more people and help more people, so they used it. They also used it as a weapon against the Catholic Church to force them to help families. So I didn't always agree with that. Having said that, my grandparents immediately agreed to go check this doll out that same day. As soon as they got there, my grandfather had already decided, and this is where I have a problem. He had already decided that this could not be a child's spirit because God wouldn't allow that. He was prejudging based on his own spiritual beliefs. My grandmother, she felt the heavy energy, and because of the way she had learned, she said, this is demonic. That's the way she trained me. You know, I get it. Heavy energy can feel that way, but that's heavy energy because it's negative. It's fear, it's anger, it's hatred. Those are negative. They hurt. They're heavy. So that's what they believed. And for the first several years, I mean, the girls were happy to get rid of the doll immediately, and my grandparents brought it home. But for the first several years, that doll sat in a rocking chair. I remember I just discovered this. My cousin just shared this story with me. They came over for Christmas Eve, the Moran family, because my grandmother was a Moran. And there was Annabelle sitting in a chair, and the kids are all running around. And of course, they want to play with the doll. And my grandfather's like, no, that doll's cursed. Don't touch it. My aunt heard that. He's like, no, hell no, we're out of here. And that was it. They left immediately. My family knew better than to mess with that stuff. But my grandparents didn't yet know how to bind it. So that was the issue there. So Dave, David, the answer to your question is, I believe it can be inhuman, but it's something that is created with our own energy, given power by us. It isn't necessarily just, somebody with a disturbed mind. Having said that, I have noticed that anytime you have a negative haunting, you need to look for the underlying issues in that family that make them susceptible to negative manifestations. Now, the case I talked about where the old man was in the house and he just didn't want anybody there, that family didn't do anything wrong. There was nothing at all that they did. It's not a hard, fast rule. That's the problem with the paranormal. There are no hard, fast rules.
Mm-hmm.
But more often than not, there's going to be maybe mental illness, maybe an out of control psychic, maybe domestic violence or drug abuse or what have you. And I try to tell the people we serve, look, it's okay to tell us. We're not prejudging you, and we're not going to say, oh, well, you're using drugs. That's all it is. No, that's going to be, you're using drugs. That's the doorway it used to come in and manifest.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have to deal with it holistically. We have to help you, not just with the paranormal. People think we're going to come in, wave a magic wand, and it's all going to go away. But the truth is, we're walking beside you. This is your spiritual battle, and we're there to help. Maybe we can guide and lead a little bit, but if you're not alongside us, if you're not fighting with us, if you're not doing what is necessary for you to protect yourself, I can close the door, but you're just going to reopen it again.
Yeah, is it safe to say, in your opinion, that it's a matter of a creative force that's very malleable? It's like gray clay that is yet to be formed into a structure, or in this case, maybe an emotion or an action or something that we don't quite know how we access it, but we all probably have that ability to do it. But for most of it, it's at a subconscious level. It's not intended, but it does make you, look at the whole aspect of spirituality and say praying, mantras, uh, a parade, what sporting events, something like that, where you have a mind all focused on one common goal. I mean, it's very optimistic when you view it that way, because it says that human minds put together to one goal, one vision, could create anything, right? But when you look at it from the Hollywood aspect, and I kind of want to talk about that a little bit here. I think our audience is probably tuning in because of the Conjuring movies, and again, you talked about Annabelle, but we tend to, as you're saying, make it a negative force. And I'm wondering why do you think people are so attracted to, say, the horror movie genre, which Dan and I love that stuff. But we understand that, it's Hollywood, but there are cases where, as you're describing, things can get pretty tricky, pretty scary. Why do you think people are really into that, and especially the negative, scary part?
Well, you asked me a lot of questions, so let me first clarify a couple of things.
Mm-hmm.
There are human spirits. People are people. When we die, it's just like your car breaking down, you get out. So those are real. Inhuman spirits are a manifestation because human beings cannot handle the unknown. We would rather believe in the devil than believe in something we cannot explain. We need to label it. Because then we can handle it. I can say prayers against the devil, but against the unknown, I'm terrified. What can I do with that? So we make these things manifest in a certain way according to our beliefs. And I can get into a million different psychological theories about that, but it's not necessary right now. I love horror as well. It's cathartic in some ways. It's a release.
Yeah.
And we are, again, by nature, we are storytellers. This gives us power over the dark.
Right.
So I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, it puts a more positive spin on the idea that, we want to scare, we enjoy the adrenaline and the scare factor, but it is, as you're explaining here, it's a way to master or feel more safe in that dark space, that unknown space. So that puts a positive spin on it.
Well, yeah, and you mentioned that earlier, and I wanted to bring that up. I'm not fascinated by the paranormal at all. I don't do this because I love it. I do it because the media, social media, Hollywood, they pump out fear.
Yeah.
And with me growing up in fear and then conquering it at 16, that's the gift I want to give people. I want to help them with understanding and bringing them out of the dark. We have such amazing power. Now, I used a term earlier, tulpa. A tulpa is actually a Tibetan Buddhist term. It is a spirit created intentionally, normally, by a very, very good monk who is able to manifest, for instance, a tiger in the halls of the monastery to chase after novitiates who are being a little too noisy when they're supposed to be praying.
Right.
If we know how to harness these powers, if we can let go of our fear, I think we're capable of miracles.
Now I'm going to throw it back to Dan because I know he's got a lot of questions. I've got plenty more, but do you see a moral compass embedded in this unknown, this collective, unconscious realm? I mean, is there a good, is there a bad, or is it just anything goes? Is there a direction that we should go, or that we're pulled towards or go against? What do you think about that idea?
I'm a pastor who doesn't believe in any religion. I've studied them all. And I found my faith when I accepted my ignorance in understanding God's plan. I believe in God 100%. I don't understand God. God is kind of like, we're like three blind men touching an elephant in different
The
parts,
elephant, right?
Mhm.
you know? And all of us have got the tiniest idea of what that is. And we're all wrong.
Mhm.
I think that I have to have faith, not that everything's going to turn out fine, because that's never going to be the case. We're all going to die, but I have faith God's going to put me where I'm needed. I'm just one thread in an infinite tapestry, and I don't have the perspective to understand that. So I believe that we are here to learn to love unconditionally, without attachments,
Yeah.
with compassion and empathy for others. And I think that's part of the reason death exists. It gives immediacy to life. It makes us move and care. Because if you're never going to die, if no one's ever going to die, who cares if they don't have enough food to eat for the next year? They're still going to be alive. They're still going to be moving. And within 100 years, God only knows what they'll be capable of. But this gives us a reason to care and to love and to be back there for them.
Well, let's throw it back to Dan. I do want to, before we let you go, I really want you to weigh in on the whole artificial intelligence, what appears to be a revolution on the horizon here, and how that affects all these areas, spirituality, etc. But
Have you been reading my book? I haven't
I
finished it yet. Where
I
did you
haven't,
get?
these things naturally lead into these topics. You just can't. It goes there, and what you're talking about, you just, if you continue to think deeply about these subjects, I think we all end up here. And it's what I find great about this show is that regardless of the guest we interview, and regardless of the subject area he or she is interested in, we can still come back to this part that you're talking about. This, what's the meaning of life, death, consciousness, the quantum realm versus consciousness in our everyday life, whatever. We kind of end up in the same place, which is very comforting given that most of these things are still just giant mysteries where you can barely have anything that you can hang your hat on, right? It's very frustrating, but it's comforting to know that they're all connected at some fundamental level. At least that's what we've concluded. Anyway, Dan, you go ahead. Ask a bunch of stuff about The Conjuring and wherever you want to go.
Chris probably doesn't have 4 hours to
I
spend
know.
listening to my questions. So we've had Barry Taff on our program before. Are you familiar with?
No, I'm sorry. Is he a paranormal person?
Yeah, he's a
I
guy.
don't follow them.
Yeah.
Any of them.
Anyway, his claim to fame, one of them was he investigated the entity case in
Oh,
California. And he basically maintains that I was focusing on this poltergeist phenomena, that most poltergeist phenomena is not something that's caused by the spirit of a dead person. It's almost psychokinetic energy that's coming from a person. I'm thinking you're agreeing with that.
yeah, usually that's true, but not always. You
Okay.
can't just say that's what it's going to be. I had a similar case to the entity, and that would be the haunting in Connecticut case, where two people were being sexually attacked.
All right,
Well,
very
actually,
similar.
three. Yeah.
Yeah, very similar. So let's talk about some of the cases that were made into movies and what we know about Hollywood is, and I think we experienced this with Travis Walton. There's his story, and then there's Hollywood's story about what happened. That's not necessarily the same thing. Talk about the Amityville case.
You know, people don't understand that case at all, and they want to say that it was just a hoax for money, etc. My grandparents were in there once for one day. They were invited by Channel 5 News out of New York. They had been called, and they said the news said, "Look, we've been told about a haunted house. We want you to check it out. It's on Long Island." My grandparents agreed. That night, even before they went, they were horribly attacked, and they went in. My grandmother famously said this was as close to hell as she ever hoped to get.
Hmm.
My grandfather also had experiences in there where he went down in the basement, and as he was getting to the bottom of the stairs, he said it felt like a heavy wet blanket was thrown on his shoulders, and he was knocked to his knees. But there are lots of photos of my family in that house. Every single one of those photos was taken by a news photographer. They were not taken by my family. So believe what you want. George and Kathy Lutz, they had a lot of problems. There was a lot of conflict. George was a former Marine. He was a former biker in a club. He didn't get along with the boys, and there was a lot of tension. Given that household had already been the scene of a horrific murder or a set of murderers, uh, it makes sense that they were open to whatever was there. They never made a penny on any Amityville movie, not one. Nor did they make a penny on the book. So this old story of them sitting around with, was it Jay Anson that wrote the book? I can't recall now.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Whomever wrote the book, they supposedly sat around having wine and coming up with a story. That's ridiculous. I was actually in the jungles in the Sierra Nevadas of Colombia. I was learning from the Kogi people. And luckily there was this solar powered, whatever the thing is that gives you internet. I'm not a tech guy. So I had internet, and I got a call from Christopher Lutz,
Hmm.
and he threatened my life. He thought I was making movies, and he said that, that was a horrific case. He hated my family for making it famous. He thought I was making these movies, and he wanted me to stop. I was like, look, buddy, I have nothing to do with this.
And let me ask you a point of clarification. Christopher Lutz was George Lutz's kid?
Stepson.
Stepson, okay.
Yeah, one of two. There was another one who wrote or did a documentary called My Amityville Horror. I think that was his name, Daniel Lutz, I think.
Yeah, I'm
But
not sure.
I've never talked to him, so I couldn't say. And I never saw the documentary, but
So
that was a real case, and it was
yeah,
really bad.
okay.
That sounds like a case where there's, do you feel like there's some sort of residue that's remains, sort of a morphogenic field or something? Rupert Sheldrake's kind of idea where
Hmm.
pile negative sentiment upon sentiment, especially if you get multiple witnesses, people involved, victims, you just this intense pain, trauma. Does it leave an imprint in three-dimensional space? Does it, reminds me of that we interviewed a guy named Isaac, a friend of ours from Olympia, and he would go into a room and he could feel, what was it, Dan? He would know where the furniture had previously been, like it had been imprinted in, or the history of the furniture, something like, well, he's a carpenter too, so that he really resonated with structures and pieces of wood. Anyway,
That's interesting to me. I mean,
yeah,
because there's no emotion tied to that. I have a theory where,
yeah.
they talk about residual hauntings,
Hmm.
but that whole idea of the stone tape theory was actually created for a BBC docudrama back in the early 70s. It's there's no science behind it at all. I'm
Okay.
working on another theory, which is called temporal overlap theory, where
Mhm.
in locations like battlegrounds or the Tower of London or wherever where many people are having intense feelings, or dungeons
Yeah.
where you're pumping out tons of energy because of your terror over an extended period of time. Yes, you can create a quantum tunnel, because all
Mhm.
time is now. And if you think of time and space as a tabletop,
Mhm.
spirits would necessarily be above that. They're not part of time and space, they're outside of it. So they're not limited in time. And I think that the same is true with this energy. But I believe that there's a tether when we remember those locations. So we're never going to see a Stone Age battlefield because we don't remember those. We have no memory of those. We don't go back and renew that connection. But Gettysburg, we're constantly going back there. The Tower of London, we're constantly going back there. If you look at the Brown Lady of Raynham Hall, famous photo from the 1920s. The story started in the 1800s of this lady who would come down the stairs and people would see her.
Hmm.
But over time, people have forgotten about her, and it's not as famous and it's not as renewed in people's consciousness. And now you'll never see photos. And even over time, you saw them starting to become less and less clear, less distinct. And I think that's because that conscious tether is gone.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that makes
So
sense.
yeah, it is similar to what you're talking about, a morphogenic field, that energy pumping out, creating something. But I can also see it as being more of an egregore, some spirit created from that trauma, that pain that starts to take on a life of its own.
Yeah, and wasn't it one of, I don't know if, I never remember, CIA, FBI study of psychics in the late,
CIA.
was it CIA's late 70s, maybe into the, well, of course it went black
Into the
at one
piece.
point. But I always remember the one line that came out of that. The conclusion was that um, these events, the psychic events, were intensified by intense emotion, basically. Emotion amplified accuracy rate of the psychic activity,
Mhm.
or something. It was amplified by emotion. That was the phrase that I remember.
There was also in the study of all of these different people who were remote viewers they were trying to make, and all this different psychic phenomena.
Mhm.
It came out that maybe this wasn't real, but that's because they were folding in all these different people that they were studying. There was actually one person in particular who stood out incredibly above the rest.
Mhm.
It's like we can all play basketball, but we're not all going to be Michael Jordan.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think
Hmm.
that's the best way to look at it.
Yeah, of course. Varying abilities, and we seem the majority of us seem to have lost that connection if we had it. I think we all have the inherent ability somewhere in there, but we've either been disconnected from outside, or we have just lost it over time because we didn't need it for evolutionary, blah, blah, blah. But
You'd be surprised. Children display it often because of neuroplasticity. Their brains are more pliable, they're more open, their pathways haven't been calcified. And also, most psychic men, in my experience, are homosexual. And I think the reason, and this is just a theory, I think the reason they are more likely to be sensitive to these things is because it is dangerous to be homosexual in most cultures in the world. Plus, they have a little more freedom to be sensitive themselves and aware of their emotions. Most of us heterosexual guys are, taught we got to be men, and rational, not open to that crap. I had my grandmother. I'm lucky. But in my experience, of all of the psychic men I know, I've only met 3 or 4 who are heterosexual.
It's probably a good theory, yeah. And kids, unfortunately, we tend to
teach them to ignore it.
Teach them to not be open to that particular inherent ability, maybe. Again, I want to talk about AI. I know that we're pushing up against an hour here. But I also wanted to mention, have you had any interaction with Dean Radin, some of the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab that's no longer exists, but where they did all sorts of experiments, psi experiments, and Dean Radin is one of the more popular populist authors who's bringing the consciousness, stuff.
It may be in my research. I'll have to look. I've got a bibliography of maybe 200 or 300 studies that I'm working with right now. It's a little overwhelming. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's good that there are that many people working on it. He's part of the group that they planted these random number generators all around the globe, and they're
yes, I remember this. Yeah,
tracking them so when a major event, say 9/11 or something, a natural disaster occurs, these devices tend to diverge from randomness, and they're trying to figure out why. It's not always up or down, less or more.
It's a very small percentage, but yes, it is worth noting. You're right.
And Dean Radin is the guy who said, yes, it's a very, very small percentage, but it's still statistically significant. They have a lot of data points that make it undeniable, in his opinion, that something is happening. But again, that goes with that collective, consciousness thing, universal consciousness, which is very fluid, obviously. But again, I want to talk about AI. Maybe we can end on that. Dan, if you have some more, because Dan's so much more knowledgeable about the movie aspect and the cases themselves. I don't remember the details of cases, but you've got to have worked on other cases that Dan, you're interested in, right? The Amityville, the Conjuring is still.
Yeah, talk about
the whole
first. Talk
franchise,
about
right? You got to talk
one
about
of those. One of those cases that your grandparents looked into that was made into a movie that they got totally wrong.
Yeah.
Conjuring 2 is terrible. Unbelievably bad. People love it, but they're trying to combine Amityville and Enfield together, and they've created The Nun, which James Wan created The Nun. It doesn't exist. There's nothing real about it whatsoever. That movie just irritated me to no end. This idea of Valak and my grandfather hanging by his fingertips out of a bedroom window, and my grandmother making it through a flooded basement, and then she shouts out the name Valak, like that's going to do squat. I mean, come on. That is the most ridiculous movie ever. I haven't seen all of the movies. I just can't anymore. This next one that's coming out is based on a case I worked on with my grandparents in college, and I just don't know if I want to see this you know, in the movie universe, the woman playing my mother is still a teenager. My mother was almost 40 by the time that movie came out. You know, or I mean, that case happened. It was in '86, and she would have been turning 40 the next year. So no, that's ridiculous.
So can you tell us about the experience with your father, though, with the heart attack and that whole
My
Like your
grandfather.
grandfather.
grandfather? I mean, yeah, that episode.
Sure. Uh, this was the Maurice Theriault case. He's known as the character's name is Frenchie in the Nun movies. The only truth to those movies is in the credits in the first movie. You see clips from the actual exorcism. And for people who want to see the video of the exorcism, it is online on YouTube somewhere. I've seen it myself. And you'll see me. I'm there. I'm the guy standing between Bishop McKenna and Maurice Theriault. Maurice.
So Chris, let's go back to the YouTube video. So what would you be searching for on YouTube if you
The
wanted to
Exorcism
watch
of
it?
Maurice Theriault.
Okay.
So we got a call because this man was having things happen in his home. It was him and his wife, Nancy. He had come from an incredibly abusive life. He had PTSD, massive trauma, very difficult. He couldn't read, couldn't write, but he did speak French. He was a farmer, poor farmer. And he was up in Warren, Massachusetts. Things started moving around the house. There was a woman in white who appeared in the field when he was out plowing. So many different things, but one in particular stands out, which was he was in the field when he felt a burning in his back. When he went back to the house to have his wife look at it, there were words cut into his back in French. Only he could speak French, nobody else could. And it said, "The door is open." So the day we got there, and this time was both my grandparents, myself, and my partner, Ray Jefferson, we interviewed him. And my grandfather decided, it's probably his father that's causing this. His father was a monster. His father had called him one day and said, "Maurice, I just want you to know I love you." And then while Maurice listened on the phone, he walked into the next room, picked up his rifle, shot Maurice's mother, and then shot himself. So we convinced Maurice to go to his father's grave, tell him he forgave him, tell him he loved him, and ask him to be at peace. Maurice was about 10 feet away from me, crying his eyes out in front of the grave when we all heard him get punched so hard underneath the chin that it lifted him off the ground and about 10 feet backward onto his back. That's when my grandfather decided that me and Ray were going to be spending several nights there. And over the next couple of months, we were there constantly. I saw him come under possession. We were in the greenhouse and we were planting seedlings, helping them. It was early spring. Maurice was saying that his back felt very cold. And I said, "Well, walk on over to the wood heater and get warmed up. We'll continue working." I didn't think anything of it. And then Ray said, "Chris, look at him." And his eyes took on this like snake-like slits, and he was drooling blood. And I was like, "Oh, okay. Ray, take Nancy up to the house. I'll deal with this." And at the time, I was Christian. And so I was making the sign of the cross in front of me, and I was saying, "By the power of Jesus Christ, I command you to be gone," again and again, until he came out of it. I don't know how long it took. It couldn't have been more than a few minutes. But he complained that something was wrong with his back still. So I asked permission to pull up his shirt, and I did. And his white t-shirt had 3 bloody red crosses soaking through. But when I lifted the t-shirt, there was blood on his back, but there were no cuts. So I said, "All right, Maurice, I need to have this t-shirt." Now it was cold, so we walked back to the farmhouse. He took off his shirt in front of me, handed me the t-shirt, and there was no blood on it. I wanted to have it tested at the University of Connecticut, where I was going to school at the time. And it was gone. So that day, we had already done a house cleansing of a poltergeist case I had been working on in Tewksbury. And then we went to do the exorcism. As we're preparing, and Maurice is in his chair, there's 3 men behind Maurice. I'm in front of him, and little tiny Bishop McKenna is fearlessly standing up to him. Maurice is rocking back and forth. His belly's killing him. And I hear my grandfather complaining that he doesn't feel well. And this is one of the reasons I don't trust psychics. My grandmother looked right at him and said, "Ed, why don't you have a banana? You're probably low on potassium." Yeah, she couldn't see he was having a heart attack. Now, the exorcism went well. Now, Bishop McKenna was a pre-Vatican II Catholic priest who had left the church because he didn't agree with getting rid of the Latin Mass. But he was very, very holy. I mean, he and the Dalai Lama were probably the holiest men I've ever met in my life. And he did the exorcism. There's this conceit that you have to have the demon's name to get rid of it. That's not true. He didn't have it. But the next day, I got a call from my grandmother that my grandfather was in the hospital. He had had a massive coronary. But that case influenced me more than any other because I was already learning psychology at school. A year and a half later, I was in Africa in the Peace Corps when my grandparents got a phone call. Nancy was getting a restraining order against Maurice because he was coming under possession again. She couldn't go through it again. She couldn't handle his darkness. One night, he was under possession. He waited for her to come home. As she was getting out of the car, he blew her arm off with a shotgun, dragged her into the kitchen, sat her at the kitchen table, and she was sure she was going to die, just like Maurice's mother. But at the last moment, he took his own life instead. It taught me if we don't deal with cases holistically, if we don't get them the psychological help they need as well, then things can manifest again. They can come back. He didn't have the spiritual armor, the psychological strength to withstand that.
Very interesting. So, Chris, let me maybe wrap this up because I'm conscientious about our time. Do you have a website?
Yeah, WarrenLegacyFoundation.com, WarrenFiles.com, WarrenLegacy.com. If you go there, if you need help, all of our services are free and confidential. You just fill out a form so we have a better understanding of what we're dealing with, and we will get you the help you need. If you'd like to join us, we're very selective about who joins us. Our clients come first. You know, we're not into this for ego. We're not into this for publicity. We're doing God's work as far as I'm concerned. So if you need help, you can also find me on Instagram or Facebook or TikTok. I'm easy to reach. I'm not a famous person. I'm not interested in being that. I'm happy to answer. I try to answer every single person that reaches out to me.
Can we find your books on your website, or do we go to
No, not yet.
Amazon?
I haven't finished writing it, and I plan on only doing one. I do not want to do more. I am not going to be pumping out books. This one is examining the paranormal consciousness and reality using these stories as a platform to go into deeper questions, such as the evolution of consciousness. And if AI becomes consciously aware, truly aware, I honestly think that's an evolution of consciousness. The universe, if you look at the theory of panpsychism, it's the idea that every single particle in the universe has some form of consciousness. People ask, is the universe aware? Well, you're part of the universe. You're aware. You are the universe looking back upon itself. And it's happening everywhere in the universe. The idea of animism, which is an ancient idea that I studied in Africa, is the idea that everything in nature, everything around you has power. It has energy, has a spirit in it, if you will. I don't know that I agree exactly with that, but I do think that we are only barely scratching the surface of reality. And we have to be comfortable with our ignorance and humble about that. I have no problem saying I don't know. That's where understanding starts.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Well, I really appreciate you taking your time today to visit with Dave and I. And if we have some weird shit happening here in Olympia, maybe we could have you come up and help us deal with that. Would that be a fair thing to ask?
Absolutely. I mean, somebody's going to have to pay my way. I can't afford it.
Well,
I'm on a disability pension, but if I'm needed,
okay.
if I can get there, I'll be there.
Well, I
Right.
want to say, I just want to say, Chris, before we sign off here, that we really appreciate your experience. I can only imagine the things that you've experienced, living in over 100 different places. That alone blows my mind. And the number of people you've talked to, the experiences you've had. I will never have that in my life, most likely, because I'm kind of a homebody. Dan and I could probably both say that. However, we do love talking to people who've been out and about and are able to bring that to us and to our audience, of course. I just want to say thank you for that, for sharing your experiences with us. And again, like Dan said, if you're in this area, look us up. If you want to come back anytime, we'd be happy to have you get new experiences. You finish the book. Finally, I wrote one, so I know how exhausting that can be, and I can understand why you don't want to spend time sitting around typing stuff. It's just you can be out talking to people and experiencing. But if you do finish that book, when you do, let us know, and we'll have you back on so you can talk about that too.
Thank you. I will definitely finish it soon.
Okay.
It's important. My grandmother has been pushing me to do it, and she even recently made sure that I got the last recorded work of my grandfather, and I'm going to be using that to help me get that book out there. So yeah, they want this done probably more than I do.
You know, hurry up and finish that thing.
That is exactly what she said. She came to me and she said, I'm looking at everything that's going on in her home and I'm saying, what's going on? She said, don't worry about that, dear. What's going on with your project? You need to finish that right away. Like, okay, I'm working on it.
Well, grandma knows best. We all know that.
Oh yeah, especially her.
Anyway, thanks again, Chris, very much.
Yeah,
Have
thank
a
you,
good
Chris.
rest of your day.
I appreciate it.